Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. So my name is Martin O'Leary. I'm the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my 40s with long hair and a beard, wearing a sort of dusty pink hoodie today. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So especially big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Can anyone who's new to the studio put your hand up? Loads of people today. Welcome. Thanks, Laurence. You're bringing in a new crowd. So this bit's for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, UE Bristol and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. What we do is we offer studio space, including desks, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And most of all, we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. So just a few quick notes before we begin. Please do feel free to move around. There's a kitchen back there. You can grab a cup of tea or coffee or a glass of water. We have a quiet space just next to this space. So to my left, your right, just around the corner, there's a little room. If you need to take a break at any point, you can go in there. There's some sofas and beanbags, and it's fairly well soundproofed. We are not expecting a fire drill today. If you hear a fire alarm, it's probably real. The studio team will direct you in the event of a fire, but in any event, the fire exits are at the other end of the studio. Again, my left, your right, at either side. They're fairly clearly signposted. And there are accessible toilets, including baby change, over there in the corridor next to the kitchen. Don't see any babies here today. You never know. There's baby change. It's available. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the talk. For those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Laurence is here. He will be your voice in the room today. For those of you who are here, we will send around a microphone so that the folks at home can hear what you're saying. You can get news on all of our future talks, or at least some of our future talks. It's the future talks that we've managed to get up there so far by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, at pmstudiouk.bsky.social on Blue Sky, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. If you are following us on Twitter/X, we are not posting on there anymore because of everything. So please don't rely on that for news about our talks. Anyway, that's enough from me. Our speaker for today is Laurence Kent. Laurence is a lecturer in digital film and television at the University of Bristol, whose research explores contingency and noise within screen media. And today he's going to talk about the history of blurred images to understand how and why they've been a focal point for such consternation, as well as alternative aesthetic delight. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Laurence.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. This is something I'm working on, something sort of that I want to be a book eventually. I feel like I've been working on it for a while, but I also feel like I haven't started it. I feel like I've kind of sort of done the groundwork in some ways. So I'll sort of throw out some ideas, pull some things together. And I'd be very interested in what you think. You know, there's thinking about the history of blurred images or blurring in images. There's loads of different examples. If you have any, it'd be really great to hear them. There's also a whole technical side of things that I'm sort of pretty hazy on. So I think if anybody can help me with any of that, I'd love that. Good. Okay, I'm going to start with a kind of prologue. Has anybody heard of rods? Creatures from another dimension. So there was these documentaries in the late 90s, early 2000s by Jose Escamilla that discovered this new creature, this new thing that was living amongst us. And conveniently at the same time as the proliferation of digital technologies, suddenly these things started to be picked up on camera. And you can see some of them here, these supposed rods, these online life form that somehow lives among us. It's sort of some sort of UFO, some sort of unidentified life form, something from a different dimension. Personally, for me, I at some sort of young age, for some reason, watched this documentary on rods when it came out in the late 90s. I think there was a re-release in sort of early 2000s maybe. So maybe I was 12, maybe I was even younger, and I watched this documentary about this supposed like interdimensional alien life form that we've only just discovered. These are in this sort of cave of swallows that with sort of base jumpers being photographed. Suddenly these new creatures are coming along. And in the back of my mind for the last 20 years, there's been rods. There's been this thing like, there's this sort of thing that exists in the world that I haven't really ever heard of again. And sort of more recently I started looking it up again and realized that it was just this sort of slightly crackpot theory, or sort of this sort of quite quickly debunked thing that happened in the sort of end of the 90s, early 2000s. So of course, it's this conspiracy about intergalactical into sort of dimensional objects is not true. It's obviously sort of some kind of hoax, some sort of error of sorts. You know, it's quite quickly debunked because these are artifacts. These are blurs, essentially. These are insects that are going across the camera and being blurred so to look like these new creatures. And I remember the show spent a long time trying to work out how fast they must be going in order to sort of be in all the places at once. There was one where sort of it worked out that it could go through a hurricane because it was seen with the winds, which again, they're artifacts, they're blurs. So of course, you know, we shouldn't take this perhaps very seriously, but I think I want us to take it a little bit seriously when we start thinking about the blur. What if, maybe not these sorts of aliens or whatever, but in some sense, the blur does open some new dimension? And that's sort of germ of the idea that I'm going to carry on throughout this talk, thinking about the blur more widely. But I want to start proper with a bit of an epigraph. Okay. So who then is making such a racket at the door? The gods come here to save from a possible danger the one who deals with the divine through style, the benefactors, the benevolent, the messengers, the angels. Who is making this noise, this wind, these voices, these tongues? The Holy Ghost, the Paraclete, the gift giver. The interrupter is an intercessor and a favourable one. No, say no to the powers of noise to be able to hear oneself, listen to oneself, understand oneself. Get thee behind me, Satan. Eliminate the parasites from the channel so the message can go through as best it can, the imperative of purge. Thus exclude the third, the demon, prosopopoeia of noise. If we want peace, if you want agreement between object and subject, the object appearing at the moment of the agreement, at the Last Supper, as well as the laboratory, in the dialogue as well as the blackboard, we have to get together, assembling, reassembling, against whoever troubles our relations, the water of our channel. He is on the other bank, the rival is. He is our common enemy, our collective is the expulsion of the stranger, of the enemy, of the parasite. The laws of hospitality become the laws of hostility. Whatever the size of the group, from two up onto all humankind, the transcendental condition of its constitution is the existence of the demon. So today I want to kind of explore this demon that is blurring within images and sort of tease out what it might mean, the other dimensions it sort of in a sense opens up, as well as thinking about this relationship to labour and the sort of history of the science of work in sort of pre-cinematic photographic experiments, as well as sort of aesthetic experiments with time. The blur is a sort of index of lost time, or time in some sense. And then to sort of read across very briefly, bringing things together as such, horror cinema and blurring, action cinema and blurred images, as well as more contemporary media practices, including photo unblur, the sort of Google Pixel app, as well as sort of memes that utilize blurring, as well as sort of anti-surveillance technologies, etc. In a sense, the state of the project is I'm trying to bring these things together. I've called it Blurry Logics because I also want to think on this sort of like meta level about both how to think about blurring in images, but also to think of blurring as a kind of methodology, or as blurring as a problem of methodologies as such. I don't want to sort of fetishize unclear thinking, or sort of, it's not sort of perhaps a poetic way of thinking about the subject, as well as I don't want to sort of fetishize sort of over clarity or legibility. But I think that there's something that I'm sort of trying to think about in this sort of blurring as methodology, or the blurring as problem of methodology, that I want to sort of, again, have in the back of your minds throughout what I'm talking about. Because what I'm doing is sort of bringing together lots of different examples that on one hand aren't the same thing, right? To say that these are the same thing is perhaps to risk a kind of blurring between different examples. I've been trying to think about it in terms of sort of the resolution of thinking. With the highest resolution of thinking, everything seems so separate, but it's only when you're slightly blurred or there's a sort of lower resolution of thinking that you sort of start to see patterns emerge or things sort of blur into each other. They sort of become similar in some sense. So I was thinking of the sort of images that if you squint, you can see words, that if you can see the words that come up there, something about getting gas. So that's a sort of methodological question I'm sort of having in the back of my mind. So, I don't want to sort of totally clarify the blur. I want to sort of think it through the bigger picture, sort of whatever resolution we get. So where I start is sort of early photographic, sort of pre-cinematic experimentation and the birth of cinema in the sort of scientific interest in understanding locomotion, in understanding how bodies move. And one of the sort of key players in this is Etienne Jules Marais, who is this physiologist working with new technologies and methods of experimentation in the second half of the 19th century. So his goal was to make movement, to sort of record and make legible movements that are imperceptible to the human apparatus. So you can see here he sort of started with inner movements like pulses and organs. So he worked with a kind of traceology where, as you can see here, sort of birds' wings rubbed against cylinders, and the movements were sort of registered as such. You've got bracelets attached to horses' feet registering air pressure, etc. Francois Dagenet writes that, quote, on Marais' work, nature had to testify for itself, to translate itself through the inflection of curves and subtle trajectories that were truly representative. There's a move away from sort of the focus of the eye on what can be seen in movement to a sort of technological grappling with those things that the eye couldn't see. And there is a sort of larger ethical question of lots of physiology and experiments with inner movements through vivisection and the sort of like murdering of countless animals to find out what was going on inside. So these devices also had this sort of interesting ethical bent. So Marais was influenced by Edward Muybridge's experiments with horses and photography. For those who maybe don't know, Muybridge, sort of important figure in the sort of development of moving images, sort of was interested, or there was a famous bet about horses' movements, the movements of their feet. The bet was, is there a moment when a horse gallops when all of the feet are off the ground at the same time? It's interesting to think that there was a time when that wasn't possible to see, it wasn't possible to know. So Muybridge used these to work out, and I'm pretty sure, as you can see, there is a moment. I can't find the moment, but there's a moment, yes, when they are all off the ground. So Marais was influenced by this and sort of developed his own form of sort of photography to try and think through and grasp movement and the movement of bodies. So this was called chronophotography, which literally means time photography. It was made by putting sort of multiple exposures on the same plate, incorporating both spatial and temporal coordinates into one image. So the smaller images of intervals of movement was sort of a way of getting to these new understandings of locomotion. What I'm interested in, maybe you can already start seeing the blur within these images, is this sort of tension between the way that there's a desire for legibility of sort of body parts in this sort of analytical and eventually pedagogical use of the images, as well as the sort of the limits of these technologies. There's sort of this moment where something's lost in between movements, which is registered only as a kind of blur. So this sort of interest in the movement of bodies is often seen as the birth of the science of labor. Trying to understand how bodies move was about trying to understand how they could move more efficiently in different ways. And this sort of ideology, or this position, this way of thinking, or this assumption rather, of the body as a kind of machine to be worked out, its movements to sort of be tracked and logged, was important for the development of many different sort of strands of the science of labor, eventually sort of Taylorism within sort of understandings of expenditure. This focus on sort of discontinuous gestures sort of laid the groundwork for new ways of thinking about human action and work. So Anton Rabinbach, in this book called The Human Motor, says that, quote, investigations into the dynamic laws of the body in motion created a new science of human labor power. There's lots of different sort of examples of this in the late 19th and early 20th century. Felix Regnault, for example, conducted studies into military marching using these technologies, trying to find the best way for soldiers to bend their knees and position their feet in order to produce the least sort of fatiguing movements. Angelo Mosso invented the ergograph to sort of measure different kinds of work and endurance. Again, this is sort of tapping into inner movements as well, and I think this relates to the sort of polygraph as well as a sort of lie detector. Jules Aymar wanted to sort of, again, measure the most amount of work possible before exhaustion and the minimum amount of rest needed afterwards to continue working. And already there's sort of politically quite fraught questions that I think will come, hopefully, back when we start thinking in a more contemporary landscape. He was using sort of in the sort of 1907 to 1909, he was using test subjects from Biskra prison in the Algiers to sort of work out these sort of movements and sort of test out the sort of extent that the body can be pushed to exhaustion. And here's where the technologies take on slightly different places within this larger idea. You both have these technologies as experiments. They sort of are trying to see how movement works, but they also then have these sort of a pedagogical purpose. It's both about finding out how the movements work, but then these technologies, recording devices, can be used to teach others how to move in some ways. So Jules Aymar says that, quote, "Disorderly and useless movements, which inevitably give rise to premature fatigue, will be reproduced by means of the cinematograph, exaggerating them if need be." So we have that training purpose, that pedagogical aspect. Again, politically, lots of this is quite fraught. I mean, within their own understandings, there was this sort of early 20th century brain view of a social good. So Rabenbach summarizes this sort of idea of what they were thinking, as quote, the intimate connection between social efficiency and social harmony, that they thought by sort of working out how the body could be pushed to the furthest, there would be this sort of utopian man as machine kind of like vision that we sort of, I guess, see in some ways in Taylorism. But as I said, at the same time as all of this, there are these limits to these technologies, and the sort of visual limits to the technology is seen in the blur. The moments when the analytic readability comes to a limit, and the different effects of Murray's work comes into view, and the sort of aesthetic potential is realized. And what's interesting about Murray's work is that it both had this sort of influence on the science of labor, but also had this influence on the development of aesthetics, and especially aesthetics wanting to think about time, especially in modernity. Martin Jay, for example, Martin Jay spells it out when he says, "Blurs still occurred when movement exceeded the technological capacity of the apparatus." And so we get sort of like interesting artistic movements that are interested in these sort of in-between bits as sort of trying to grasp a kind of like lost time. So this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2 from 1912. So art in this sense kind of thrives on what we could say is a kind of failure to represent its objects, intending to create a kind of excess of affect and impression over perhaps the sort of fact of representation. But also, as I'm going to sort of think through some more, it's a way of getting at time itself and apprehending this sort of direct image of time in the blur. So this is what Marianne Doane is really interested in, who's a sort of film theorist, thinking about the sort of understandings of time. Her book's called the Emergence of Cinematic Time, and the different ideas of time that sort of were being developed alongside these technologies. So she writes the quote, "The legibility of the image is directly affected by the desire to perfect a representation of time," end quote, such that making movement clear can sometimes then be inversely proportional to the ability to then represent time itself. These are sort of two directions the image takes. So it's the blurs of movement that create other kinds of representation, attempting in paradoxically to make legible through illegibility the sort of intangibility of time, if that kind of makes sense. There's an excessiveness. And Doane continues that, quote, "It is significant that the limit or failure of Murray's scientific endeavour, the blurred image, was subsequently taken up by modernism, such as Italian futurism, as evidence that the perfect representation of time, particularly its more modern aspect of speed and dynamism, was precisely illegibility. And this is kind of my groundwork, where this sort of distinction that sort of gets quite interestingly muddled between the legibility of these images and their use for analytic and pedagogical purposes, and the illegibility and the aesthetic potential of it in this sort of imaging of time. You get these sort of you get the split in time. And I think that's what I want to get to. It might not be quite opening up a new dimension in the sense of alien rods, but there's something congruent there that I want to think through. How I'm going to do it overall is sort of by tapping into this larger field of what we could call sort of noise studies. And there's lots of people writing at the moment, sort of forthcoming books, as well as other books, say by Miguel Pardo Casanova, who's at University of Bristol, England, and Cecil Malaspina, whose book, An Epistemology of Noise, is like one of the most incredible books ever for trying to think through what noise means. It's a massive field that I wouldn't be able to do much justice to in the sort of time I have available, but it's interested in how noise means different things in different contexts. There's both the sonic aspect of noise, but then there's noise in finance, trading, for example. There's sort of noisy images, as I've sort of thought through. And then there's more sort of abstract notions of noise that I'll briefly try and introduce in a second, in relationship to information theory, cybernetics, etc. And again, what I find so amazing with especially Malaspina's work is this way in which, as I was sort of trying to get at the beginning, you both have noise or blurring as an object of study, but it also becomes a problem for method. It's both what is noise in the sense that what is noise pollution, what is noise trading, but it's also how do these different concepts of noise themselves produce noise between them, that noise means something different in different places. So there's this meta second level of noise, which is epistemological noise, which again, I'm trying to think through eventually through the notion of blurring. I mean, my initial quote that I gave you, which was from Michel Serres, is a 1980s sort of more sort of French philosophy kind of book. It plays on the sort of multiple meanings of noise, of the parasite, which means, in French, it means a biological intruder. It's also a spatial demarcation, parasite, sort of like para to the site, as well as meaning static noise. And Serres interested in the sort of this fuzzy interpretation of the word, and sort of, as you heard from the sort of quite evocative epigraph that I gave, sort of thinking quite widely and quite poetically. Noise is important for Serres because it's reversible, it's perspectival. So Serres writes the quote, "Noise and message exchange roles according to the position of the observer and the action of the actor, but they are transformed into one another as well as a function of time and the system." So interrupter becomes interrupted, and there's this whole sort of cycle where noise becomes signal in different contexts. More recent work sort of tries to develop a more clarity to this concept of noise, and noise becomes something quite foundational to sort of how thought works in general. Thinking itself is an act of defining noise from information in this sort of quite meaningful and ethical sense for what's going on. Again, there's this longer story that we could go into, but Malaspina is interested in how noise changes, almost flips its definition across different sort of scientific disciplines. So she looks to Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver within information theory and compares them to Norbert Wiener in cybernetics, and realizes that they have opposite definitions of information, as even though they have the same mathematical formula for it. So for Norbert Wiener, information is order. To work out the message, there's a question of order, there's a neg entropy, if you wanted to think in terms of entropy. But for Warren Weaver, who sort of articulates Claude Shannon's version of it, he writes the quote, "Information is, quote, a measure of one's freedom of choice when one selects a message." So what gets quite complicated is then that noise and information both become markers of disorder. Information is more disorder because then there's more choice in how you interpret a message, but that sounds like noise. So this is what Weaver sort of, when realizing this kind of contradiction, with the exclamation mark at the end of this passage, is really interesting. So Weaver says, quote, If noise is introduced, then the received message contains certain distortions, certain errors, certain extraneous material. That would certainly lead one to say that the received message exhibits, because of the effects of the noise, an increased uncertainty. But if the uncertainty is increased, the information is increased. But this sounds as though noise were beneficial, nice exclamation mark. So for Malaspina, this, as she writes, this quote, prepared the ground for a philosophy of noise that evades the Manichean opposition between information and noise. And as I said, she says, quote, the distinction between information and noise is a problem of ground or foundation of knowledge. So bringing this to Murray's work, noise, and in this case the blur as the sort of proxy for noise that I'm using, or sort of an instantiation of noise, becomes itself a kind of information in the aesthetic realm. So it's not a failure as such, but a direct image of time, a grasping of time. And aesthetics engagement with the blur present this fact, right, that we can see across screen media how it becomes a political question of who gets to define what is noise and what is information, because they can quite easily change position. Noise is banished from the image when it's being used for pedagogical purposes in the science of work, but it's privileged in the realm when it's an artistic endeavor. So this presents sort of two kinds of time. A time to be controlled, the science of labor, and a time always out of reach, the aesthetic grasping for this impossible movement between two dots that we call time. What I want to do now is sort of throw some examples out there to sort of see how these dynamics, this sort of quite noisy set of ideas, might come to mean something within sort of different instantiations of blurring within the history of screen aesthetics. Okay, so the examples I've gone for are the Ring and Final Destination series. Has anybody seen Final Destination, The Ring? Yeah, good. So this is the Ring, blurring within these, blurring within both the Ring and Final Destination is part of, to explain it for those who don't know rather, at some point characters are marked by death in different forms. And then when a character does this sort of interesting labor of investigation to work out what's happening, in the Ring they're sort of marked by the death of watching a videotape, and then they're phoned by this demonic presence who says you will die in 7 days. In Final Destination, they cheat death, and then they have to work out who's going to be killed then by death because they've cheated it. And in the investigation in both of these films, there's moments where, and as you can see, this is the remake of The Ring, and then Final Destination, that they find images with these sort of blurred faces. So it's this mark of sort of demonic possession as such. But again, I feel like there's an interesting way in which the blur presents to us a split in time, or sort of, again, I mean, literally the opening of another dimension into the sort of demonic. The time of action is split, and an alien, horrific, and deathly logic enters the scene, which the protagonist must attempt to sort of purge before being purged themselves. So, if the guiding question of every sort of time you meet the blur as such is kind of what other dimension is this opening up? And in case of these films, it's opening up this sort of demonic dimension, but it's also one defined by a certain kind of order and a certain kind of temporality. So in The Ring, one has 7 days in order to work it out. And in Final Destination, it's sort of, the films are about obsessively marking out and working out the order of those who died in an initial accident and then who will die in next. There's a sort of obsessive order where death is trying to gain control. So in some ways the question is this where the horror of these films lie? If Murray's blurring of cone of photography indexed to time always escaping from perception, measurement and analysis, these films give us this unknown, unknowable form of time, but in the form of a sort of rigorous, inescapable, like demonic order. Filling in then this other dimension that's reached with this notion of sort of death's design. And just in terms of film analysis, that was Final Destination. Yep. So a film sort of formalist analysis, a film scholar interested in formal analysis, Eugenie Brinkerber, is really interested in this sort of the way that Final Destination sort of thinks about order and sort of development of that kind of death's design as such. So she writes the quote, "Final Destination adds a third category of cinematic address to both narrative and spectacle, which is the graphic, this sort of shot of the graph of sort of the order which is sort of given of death's design. So the flat surface artifacts that express abstracted, formalized information. So the time controllable by humanity is mirrored by this formal order, which is then sort of made graphic, beneath and behind it, which again is indexed by the sort of horror of the blur. So the blur becomes quite an interesting sort of focal point. It's probably quite a mixed metaphor for what to think through. Okay. So the other example that I've been thinking about is action cinema, where the blur has an interesting history within sort of the development of the action film genre. I mean, you can see both of these different Bourne films as very sort of prominently showing off the blurring of their figure, the sort of blurring, which in a sense also indexes a kind of labour, the labour of the action hero, their skill, their ability to sort of go faster than we can even comprehend in some form, whether that be sort of conceptually or not. And there's a longer history of sort of action film editing, and there's been analyses of the sort of average shot length of action films and the sort of shortening of action film shots and to become sort of more muddled. So Simon Severo, explaining this trend, writes the quote, "Hollywood action scenes become more impressionistic, rendering a combat or pursuit as a blurred confusion. We got a flurry of cuts calibrated not in relationship to each other or to the action, but instead suggesting a vast busyness. Here, camera work and editing didn't serve the specificity of the action, but overwhelmed it, even buried it." And for him, he's interested in this notion of post-cinematic affect, that this is a specifically contemporary affect. That again is sort of indexed by the blur. Now, lots of scholars think of this as bad filmmaking. I mean, I'm not suggesting it's necessarily good filmmaking, and maybe I'm not particularly interested in that question. But there's been scholars such as Matthias Stork and David Baldwell who are interested in this as sort of chaos cinema, or the sort of decline of skill in action filmmaking, etc. But for Simon Severo, this noise, this introduction of blurring, this introduction of noise, isn't just a kind of mistake or a failure or bad filmmaking, but he takes this as a kind of index of a new episteme or a structure of feeling. So he uses Jacques Attali's notion of noise in the realm of the audiovisual. Jacques Attali's work is really interesting for thinking about how different kinds of noise and ideas of noise are prophetic for new social formations that sort of can tell us what might happen next. And there's this way in which Simon Severo thinks that this intense action cinema, what he calls post-cinema, is sort of prophetic of future social configurations. So we get here a sort of interesting, definition of noise and blurring as a kind of social problem or a social, or an answer to a social question, a sort of epoch-defining concept. And for Malaspina, this is certainly part of noise. She writes the quote, "Few notions are more central than noise to the transformation of modern life," end quote, such that the term, quote, "has become synonymous with the complexity of our world and its global digitized information networks." So I've tried to look at these kind of films before, and I won't go too much into it now, but I've done some work before on sort of the Transformers series, if anyone knows the Michael Bay films, to try and think through how they are noisy in some sense. And this is where, they're noisy both in maybe a literal sense of visual noise or sort of sonic noise even, but they're also sort of epistemologically noisy. They're quite hard to work out what's going on. There's a sense in which, space stops making sense in some ways. But one of the things that lots of these scholars are interested in, and what I would try to do in some of my writing, is to think through how these films, are sort of an index of a contemporary situation, a sort of contemporary understanding of speed and life and noise, or 24-hour, 24/7 sort of social configurations. And in a sort of maybe desperate attempt not to just think of them as awful films and bad things in the world, which I kind of do think Michael Bay's films are in the world a bad thing, to try and think through how maybe they're a kind of training, a training for the sort of inhuman temporalities that are often pushed upon us, the sort of unending flow that we might sort of say that many of us are caught up in. There's a great line from Steven Shaviro where he sort of says, thinking about these films, they're not radical, they might not show us new ways of living, but at least they allow us to sort of feel out the contours of the prison we're in, that we finally hit rock bottom, which is I don't know how depressing that is to take. But what if, ultimately, what if the blur in this case is this sort of a portal to a different dimension, but a sort of portal, a sort of capitalist sublime, where we are sort of trained to withstand and to sort of even navigate kind of inhuman temporalities. One of the examples that I thought was quite interesting is the prevalence of blurring within memes, right? The sort of the blurring within meme as sort of an index of very specific affects, and I think there's similarities to here. Not being able to cope, sort of becoming a blur, not being able to fit into time frames. Thank God it is Friday, but it might not be, and it might be awful because then we have to go through another blurry week of more and more and more. I mean, in a sense, and this is where sort of some of the manoeuvres get a bit less sharp. If action blurs suggest a kind of inhuman time of commerce lurking behind the scenes, then is this perhaps a sort of reversal of what I was talking about before? So within sort of post-Fordist and cognitive forms of capitalist production, from the blur, the clarity. The blur was this aesthetic interpretation of Murray's work, but it was clarity of images that were tried to sort of an index of the ability to control time and movement and bodies. But with this, the blur is something which is this time of sort of post-Fordist, I guess, capitalist production. But that's, again, a bit of a loose formulation. What I want to sort of get to as I sort of start getting to the end of my talking is to think about how the position of labour starts shifting as well. There's a sort of a manoeuvre that happens if we're thinking of the birth of the science of labour in Murray's work. You get within you get a dislocation of this into this question of computational labour, which is where I sort of want to take the project next. So these are sort of examples of Google Pixel's photo unblur, which is sort of a really interesting sort of device. There's a whole technical thing that I don't quite understand. I've been trying to work out to do with exactly how it works. I know there is sort of machine learning involved. I know there's a sort of way in which it analyzes this image down to sort of the pixel level. I know there's a sort of counterintuitive sense in which it actually sort of downsamples the image in order to put it back together. So there's this way in which it moves in the opposite direction in order to come back. But again, I haven't quite digested that into my specific way of thinking. But I'll give you the advert for Google Pixel to see what they're up to. I mean, for me, that kind of the fixed is quite terrifying. It's almost this sort of, I gave you that quote at the beginning, get thee behind me, Satan. There's this notion of being fixed in some ways. And in some ways, this is a flex, right? This is a flex of computational labor. And one of the ways that we can start thinking about this then is sort of as indicative of a larger sort of more general condition of the digital image and where the sort of how the digital image is constructed. So this is one that, again, another prop book. Shane Denson's Discorrelated Images is really interesting for thinking about the role of labour within contemporary images. So when streaming a film, for example, there are moments when rendering happens, where things blur. And that's a sign of something happening behind the image. You sort of suddenly get these sort of this reality of these microtemporal processes working behind the image, making it possible. And in the blur, in the lag, in the glitch, you get this failure that indexes something. It becomes visible, these processes behind the screen. So Shane Denson writes the quote, "Processed on the fly in an interval that is inaccessible to human perception, the images that populate our world are themselves discorrelated from human subjectivity, no longer tuned to the frequencies of human sensory access, and thus no longer essentially bound to appear at all." So here, to see a blur, generally, is to sort of become aware of computational labour behind the image in some ways. So I think my fundamental point, or what I'm sort of still circling around in some ways, is the move across these different instantiations, right? That the push to unblur photos, perhaps with Google Pixels, photo on blur, is a sort of attempt to solve something, to sort of solve the out of joint time. But it also then makes photos, it makes faces that are unblurred, it makes them available then. It makes them available for perception, a sort of site of experimentation for sort of digital gimmicks. I won't have time to go into this, but this is, if anyone knows this image, Jennifer in Paradise. It was one of the first images to sort of be photoshopped. It was one of the images that sort of the first experimentations with Photoshop happened. And there's this amazing article in The Guardian that says, this is our equivalent of the Muybridge's horses, which is a link that I haven't quite, again, digested, but I think there's something really interesting going on. That these images and sites for control, sites for exploitation, especially say under surveillance capitalism, images are being sort of taken for data, taken for training data, etc. From the cultural capital of Instafits to sort of save data of facial recognition, and then ultimately then quite material questions of sort of state recognition as state surveillance mechanisms. And similarly, if we're thinking of these divisions between sort of readability, analytics, and then aesthetics, there's also, this lots is born from a sort of aesthetic engagement with blurred images, which themselves can form sort of points of resistance against sort of forms of control. So Hito Steril, for example, is very interested in poor images. She writes that, quote, "The poor image is an illicit fifth-generation bastard of an original image. Its genealogy is dubious. Its file names are deliberately misspelled. It often defies patrimony, national culture, or indeed copyright. It is passed on as a lure, a decoy, an index, or as a reminder of its formal visual self. It mocks the promises of digital technology. Not only is it often degraded to the point of being just a hurried blur, one even doubts whether it could be called an image itself. Only digital technology could produce such a dilapidated image in the first place." And then back to memes, again, there's this sort of focus on sort of aggressively poor images, that we can take on the blur, we can take on the sort of the poorness of the image as a form of resistance. Steril's book is indeed called The Wretched of the Screen, as a sort of homage to Frantz Fanon's work. So this is sort of defining what aesthetics can mean, and this is from Lucy Chateau's work on the purposefully poor images. But also did want to flag, the importance of sort of blurring technologies for protests, and you can't quite see it at the bottom, but it's sort of promoting this idea that if you're going to a protest, be ready to sort of like not take photos. Taking photos at protests is often very bad, but also that there are devices, there's applications you can use to blur your face and to sort of try to escape some of those modes of control, say through applications like Image Scrubber. So I'll conclude in a second. I've sort of whizzed through a number of different things, again, sort of conceptual motion blur, perhaps slightly. I'm sort of trying to put all these things together to see how they do fit into sort of patterns with blurring, while also aren't. They can't be boiled down to each other, and they're not sort of all sort of definable as one single thing, but there are sort of commonalities across them, and I think finding those commonalities can be quite important. Again, I have sort of very speculative notions of what this could look like. I've gone through some of the ideas here. Murray, time, labour, thinking of spirit time, spirit photography, blurred images, ghosts, there's loads, action blurs. There's there's really interesting notions of blurring within sort of post-colonial cinema, sort of images of the desert and blurred, sort of like hazy landscapes, etc. Noisy memes, photo on blur. I haven't been able to get into. I really want to think about sort of online meetings and the blurred background, which again is about making yourself more legible for work. So there's a whole thing going on there. And then ultimately, and this is totally outside of my comfort zone at the moment, AI-generated images and the role of blurring in those. One of the more terrifying things is that AI often has to blur its images to make it seem more human, because it would seem too high definition if it wasn't blurring them to sort of take into account our foibles or something, But I'll read out just the conclusion as it is. So to tie back to the original place of the blur within chronophotography, there we saw a desire for the legibility of moving bodies to be an instrumental factor in the birth of the science of labour. And the blur, as a moment of failure, noise in the channel of communication, itself became a different kind of information when taken up as a special effect and an aesthetic technique. It marks a split in time between a controllable time of discontinuous movement and the forever lost in-between time, the becoming that hovers at the limits of representation. So I've traced this split across a few different instantiations of the blur within screen and media practices, and at the end explored photo unblur, which I claim both corrects, perhaps, and displaces this split in time. So here we have a marker for split between conceptual time and the time of the digital image of computational labour. It is now this hidden time of microtemporal processes that is the site of control and surveillance. If the birth of cinema and scientific means of capturing movement became a form of pedagogy for human labour practices of how to move and to work most efficiently, then today images are being fed through AI systems for them to learn and to maximise their computational labour. So there are finally 2 points that sort of present themselves, sort of 2 options perhaps. So to continue to blur, to be noise in the system, to embody Michel Serres' parasitical demon from sort of another dimension. But then even blurred images, as we've seen with photo unblur, even blurred images and noisy forms of communication can be captured as pedagogical tools for AI as training data. So ultimately, what's left, to stop communication totally, the rods, we're watching the rods, but the rods are also watching us. So, the only thing to do is to shut up. So, thank you. I've got another one of these.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Tim, I'm going to get your microphone. Mute it.
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. Lots of interesting relationships between blurring and truth and blurring and power. But I was wondering if there's a fundamental asymmetry between the act of blurring and the act of unblurring. You can always blur an image, but the retrieval of the underlying image, AI, as AI always does, appears confidently to produce an underlying reality, which in fact might not be the reality. And I was also thinking, even at the level of quantum mechanics, that actually material reality is intrinsically blurred. That because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? An electron could be smeared all over the universe, and it's only when you measure it that you can unsmear it, but then its momentum is completely blurred. So you can never remove the blur from underlying material reality. It's physically impossible. And I'm just sort of wondering whether our ability to control these things is, in a sense, an illusion.
Yeah, yes, definitely. It's interesting. I'm trying to think both that question of, to link the levels, right? If you think of different registers of sort of ontologies of the blur, as well as politics, where you started with, which was sort of the politics of who gets to unblur. And already I'm sort of thinking, essentially this is the political dimension of noise more generally. Who gets to decide what is meaningful and what is not? Who gets to decide what's noise in a certain situation, what's not? Politically, you'd obviously have the question of like the Overton window and ideas outside of that being a kind of noise themselves. But to think across, because although reality might be fuzzy, yeah, as you said, if someone can unblur my photo in an image and use that against me, then there's a power asymmetry there in lots of different ways. I think it is totally about power asymmetries. That's kind of exactly why questions of noise and question of blurring take on political realities. And even if they are illusions on a more fundamental level, they're realities on a sort of political level, if that makes sense. But, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Tim, please.
So my question is, you keep talking about the blurry as a splitting of time. I conceive it more like a compression of time, like a condensation of several moments in one moment. Oh no, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And again, I think what I wouldn't be fast enough to do the schematic kind of way of thinking about it maybe in the second, but that sense in which it's compressing time, and you're right, there's a sort of spatialization of time, in Murray's images where you have these instantiations. But I guess it's that moment where the compression of time reaches Marianne Doane talks about this always lost time, this sort of sense in which there's always then something lost between two movements, and that's what sort of aesthetic engagements with blur are trying to, in their sort of illegibility, make legible, if that makes sense. So it's both on two registers. That sounded hazy. But yeah, does that make sense? Or do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, both. I think you're right there, yeah.
Anybody else?
This is a slightly abstract thought, but let's see what happens. Do you think there's any mileage in the idea that you can draw a parallel between blurring in images and video and blurring in music or sound more generally? That what's in my head is sort of late 90s, early noughties French electronic music where they filtered disco as it was known because they filtered everything out apart from the bass and then filter everything back in. When the treble comes in, it sort of unblurs, it clears up. It's sort of, so if you're hearing only the bass, it's a bit like hearing the music that's happening next door. And then if you add the other elements of the song, then it becomes unblurred somehow.
That's really good. I think I had a thought today, which is, often when you introduce noise, you say, it's not just noises in sound, it's also these conceptual things. And I suddenly realized I didn't have that with blurring. I didn't really have that move. It wasn't sort of already a sonic term that you then are thinking about across domains. But that's really, I hadn't thought of it at all, this sort of question of, what happens to sound when it's blurred.
But also, why do we think of that as blurring anyway? Like, that's a preconceived idea.
Well, this is again.
What's clear?
But this is exactly.
Learned behavior.
Yes, and I think this is exactly where you start thinking about that kind of thing, which is who gets to decide what's. In some ways, who gets to decide what's noise and what's not? Who gets to decide what blurring means? But your example is really interesting because that is an intentional kind of like reduction of treble that blurs it. I feel like every time I tell someone I'm doing this project on blur, I just have to remind them I'm not studying 90s Britpop. So I've been thinking about sound, but not in the sort of way that you're thinking. And already, I don't know, I also was a trombone player, which is a famously blurry instrument for like blurring different notes and different values. I'm spitballing, but that's really good. Thank you so much. I need to think a lot more on that. Thank you so much. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I was going to ask, actually, following on from your question, was about blurring in other senses, so blurring in music, actually. So shoegaze and drone music.
Yeah.
And also the work of someone like Mika Levy, right? So they're Under the Skin. It sort of takes the notion that there's 12 notes and totally blurs the distinction between them. They sort of woozes around. So that disorientation happens both visually and with music as well,
Yeah.
And also, I was going to also made a point that maybe in future generations, the concept of a blur will be hard to understand. So what we know about blurring, outside of maybe stills photography, comes from in cinema, it's 24 frames per second. So therefore, we have that, but with very high frame rate photography over the next hundreds of years, that will disappear. So will it be hard for future generations to really understand what we mean by blur, particularly visually?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as low fidelity.
Yeah, well, this is kind of where some of it starts. And again, it's why I love that Sarah's quote, which is the imperative of purge, right? The desire for a blur-free world. Does it always reach its limitations in the limitations of technology, or is that something that will be? Is that sort of historically specific in some ways? I was thinking again about music. There's the politics of notation, right? The sort of the claim that there are 12 tones is a specifically Western one, a specific sort of historical one. So blurring is only something that registers between notes if you've already. You put it really well. I think it's already a sort of normative question, right? Of political thing.
What's the deviation and what's the...
Yes. Yeah. Well, exactly. And again, that's the politics of noise, right? That's why it's, for me, reading, and I'd very much recommend Cecil Malaspina's book. It's noise as the sort of wager of thinking, right? They're like everything you do is this sort of normative drawing of a line between what you're counting as noisy and what you're talking about as information. And I always love that fact that what you view at the moment as noisy or outside of information will turn out to be the thing that's really important and that will make sense and will turn out to be information that you were missing, like planets that were seen as anomalies before it discovered that no, they were planets and that kind of. So it's a concept that crosses domains, and I think that is really interesting. But it's one that you have to also think about the differences between domains. So that's another sort of the meta question where I think politics comes in important ways. But yeah, no, thank you so much.
Haven't quite fully thought this out in my head yet, so bear with me for a second. But within like the aesthetics of cinema and like digitization, noise has become kind of denotative of like an increasingly technological world. So that's kind of that's one thing. On the other hand, there are kind of non-rational ways of like representation has become almost like so real to the point of hyperreality, and there are non-sort of like optical ways of perception that kind of are almost like inhuman. So basically what I'm thinking about is this kind of like Western rational representation of a fish, where it's like the singular image of a fish. And then you have other ways of perceiving where if you're in the sea, your perception of tuna would be a blur going through the water. So on the one hand, you have like digitized blurs being a kind of denotation or like connotation or connotative of digitization, this like supremely technological Western rational world. On the other hand, you have blur and this kind of like non-representational thing being denotative of like, or like, whatever, you know what I mean? Like kind of similar to these like non-human, non-rational ways of perception. And I suppose I'm just wondering what you think about that, because I don't know what I think about that. Or if you even know what I mean.
There's something really, really interesting there. And it comes back to this, the desire for a blur-free world is... Yeah, I mean, my way into lots of this was through sort of French philosophy and Gilles Deleuze, and one of the really interesting things that he talks about is, I'm trying to remember, clear and distinct ideas, and he talks about sort of Descartes and this idea that good ideas or adequate ideas are clear and distinct, and he starts thinking about them against that sort of unclear or distinct by being obscure. And there's that sense in which there are, and this is the interesting thing about trying to find time in between these images and in the blur, it's ideas that only make sense in their blurredness. And I love that example of your image of fish is a blur. And there's loads of other, I mean, for some reason I'm thinking of Lovecraft and the Sugarloaf, is it, which is just a train blur or something. Some things can only be perceived as blurs. And that doesn't mean that you're not rationally thinking about it, or that they are something to be thought of as noise, as external to the rational. It's that rationally some ideas have to be blurry. I need to think about that more. But yeah, no, brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
That's probably all we've got time for. So join me again in saying thank you to Laurence. Thank you. All right, so before you all go, if you want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, please come find one of the studio team. Studio team, give us a wave. Here we are. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next time.